So here I am in Dunedin, New Zealand, and I'm talking with Helena, who is in Barcelona, Spain, one of the epicenters of COVID-19. Helena, thanks for agreeing to talk. Um, can you basically tell what the conditions are? Because as we talked about just before we started the recording, lockdown is almost this meaningless term, right? I mean,
Mm.
lockdown here is very different from lockdown for you. So maybe give anybody who's listening in, maybe years down the line to this recording, what the conditions are really that you're speaking under right now in Barcelona.
So thanks for inviting me to speak with you. And we have been, I think we're now in the fourth week of a fairly strict lockdown that has essentially meant the only reason people are allowed to go out on the street is to go buy groceries or to go to the pharmacy, or in the case of a health emergency, obviously. And you can only go out as an individual, not with anybody else. So this means no going out for exercise, no walking, parks and gardens, etc., are closed. The police will stop you and ask you where you're going. If you have children, as is my case, they can't go out. They have to stay in. And in terms of an economic shutdown, we had the first 2 weeks where everybody who could work remotely was asked to work remotely, but a number of sectors where that's not possible, so including any kind of production factory sector, the construction industry, which is quite big here, we're still working, but that stopped after 2 weeks. And so for the past 2 weeks, we've had literally no economic activity. So the construction sector's shut down. Any production that wasn't related to the health industry shut down. Essentially, everybody stopped working except for health workers, journalists, obviously anybody who could work from home, like is my case.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Just for the record, lockdown here in level 4 in New Zealand is very different. You can, and in fact are encouraged to go out for exercise. The parks are open, supermarkets are open, petrol stations are open. Essential services are functioning. Very often when you go out, you see people jogging or running. You aren't allowed to congregate in groups. You can't go surfing. You can't do anything like camping or hiking, simply because it will take the emergency services away from what they are focused on. There's a very high degree of trust in government and governance and the COVID-19 response. So public compliance has been very high. And I bring that up because home for me, as you know, is Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka lockdown is curfew, where you can't go out at all. And it's been a fairly challenging process for the people there to get basic essentials, to get basically food. Daily wage earners are suffering inordinately on account of not having the money to get what they need to survive. So, I mean, that's kind of something that we can reflect on later on as well, which is this word we use that really is contextual and means
Yeah.
very different things where you are. But I did want to talk to you today around two things, two pieces of writing that you published a couple of days ago, Digital Peacebuilding and the Pandemic in two parts. It's up on the Build Peace blog. And this is basically a very good capture in broad brushstrokes around what you see, and I agree to be some of the challenges that we have moving forward in the post-COVID-19, post-pandemic world. And I thought we'd just have a conversation around some of the points that you bring up, which I think are worth talking about a bit more. And in the first part, as much as one can talk about every single sentence as being fodder for a long conversation, there's this entire paragraph where you talk about the response to COVID-19 as being a vector or an entry point into greater control, authoritarianism, surveillance. And you build on that a bit in part 2 as well, but it kind of is a segue into some stuff that I've been posting on Twitter, where I've been using the term pandemic panopticons, where epidemiological tracing and contact tracing and contact tracking seamlessly merges into particularly in countries like Sri Lanka, but also more globally in authoritarian states, a broader, wider, deeper surveillance architecture. You haven't really you've given some examples here, but it's been a couple of days since, and we've actually had more examples coming around countries around the world, which don't show positive signs of this just stopping at contact tracing. What are your chief concerns, given that this is going to happen very likely at a scale that has been unprecedented?
I think, so many concerns. I think one of the main things that I'm concerned about is something that you alluded to in the question you just asked me, which is how this is going to be more of a slide into control. And the reason that's possible is that people are genuinely scared now. And when there's fear, there's a greater acceptance or tolerance for control. Look, of course I don't like being traced, or of course I don't like somebody knowing where I am all the time, and of course I don't like having to download this app that is going to provide my location, and of course I don't like that mobile phone companies are cooperating with the government to provide my location. But if it's going to stop the spread of this deadly disease, then I'm willing to do it.
It's an existential crisis, right?
Exactly. It's an existential crisis. And I think in existential crises, whether they are, as we have right now, a pandemic, or in times of war, it is the time when it's easiest to roll out measures of control. And I think that the difference in between something like a war, where that's rolled out and then the war ends, and then, in some places the war ends, and then, and then the state of emergency stops being a state of emergency, except for the places where, we've seen this in wars as well, where actually the state of emergency gets continued forever and ever. But in a situation like we're in right now, governments could say, look, this is the first of many pandemics. Others will come, and we need to retain the ability to control. And I think that there would be some degree of acceptance from a large proportion, if not the majority of the population in many places. And that's something that I'm concerned about, because I think that ultimately the only thing that will stop the spread of control is civil society, resistance and advocacy, and etc. And I think that is eroded by this existential crisis, essentially.
So what you said hits home, because as we speak, Sri Lanka is going to go into a constitutional crisis of hitherto unseen proportions, because there is a president who doesn't want to recall parliament, which was dissolved just before the crisis hit, the pandemic hit. And now you're looking at authoritarian creep, where there is a high degree of popular support for this one strong leader, or the projection of the fiction of the single individual backed by the military doing what is necessary to be done in order for COVID-19 to be addressed. And we'll talk about it a bit more, but I think that some of those who are listening to us may feel that this is, in the work of Build Peace, or certainly in my life, something that is unique to or exclusive to the global South. But I do want to use the language of the American president, and I put this quote up when he was asked yesterday at a press conference, and his response about his own response to COVID-19 in the US. And I quote, "When somebody is the president of the United States, the authority is total." And that's the way it's got to be. Wow. It's total, end quote. So it seems to be the case that the doyens of democracy, certainly that I grew up with, you associated with the Americans and the United States of America with democracy. And of course, in your adult life, that's a fiction that you learn to critique. But in popular discourse, you also have this awareness or awakening that it's not just the global South that this is a problem in.
No, I absolutely not. And in fact, I think you may have noticed that in the blog post, I tried to bring in a number of examples that were not from the global south, because I'm seeing this across the board. I mean, I know it's not the hallmark of democracy, but I'm sure you've seen what happened in Hungary, a member state of the European Union, right, where the government has essentially said, we will now rule by decree.
Yeah.
And there is no, there's no indication of when this will end. And the pandemic was used as the excuse. Very much. I mean, I don't think that I didn't read the quotes that were used, but probably something similar to, we need to have total control, total power.
Well, this is the war on terror moment, right? I mean, it's that same articulation.
Absolutely.
That is globally used.
Yeah.
Finds resonance.
Yeah, and I think, and then I think in places that are democracies but have some kind of conflict, this issue of surveillance is also furthering the conflict divisions. I mean, a classic example that you won't be surprised that I bring up is Israel, where location surveillance is being used to track the pandemic. But it's a state that has been known to extend states of emergency and measures of control well beyond the immediate emergency. So we have no reason to believe that they wouldn't do the same here. But even here at home in Spain, this is a lighter concern for now, if you want. I think the Spanish government is doing an incredible job, and you were talking earlier about trust in government, and there's a high degree of trust in government here as well. However, it's also being, the pandemic and the issues of control around the pandemic are also being used to stoke the divisions in between Catalonia and Spain. With the Catalan government, essentially, I think a few days ago, the Catalan president said, if when we ease the restrictions on lockdown, there's a spike in deaths, those deaths are on you, pointing to the Spanish president. I mean, that does not spell for national unity,
Yeah, no, it doesn't actually. And I'm also concerned, I want to move on, but I'm also concerned about the invisibility of all of this as we move post-COVID, where it becomes normalized and rational and the ordinary. When it is in fact the exception and should never be part and parcel of governance architectures. We can come back to that later, but I also want to move into other areas that part 2 of your writing as published focus on. And I'm going to, quote back to you stuff that you've written. And something that struck me was when you quote a friend saying, as she or he put it simply, that we are in the business of bringing people together and now we can't. And I think you're talking about peace building and peace builders here. And it struck me because we are still in the business of bringing people together. And I think what this quote is anchored to is the physical and kinetic act of bringing bodies together. And it did occur to me that we have been doing the digital virtual version of it. But I wanted to flesh this out a bit more, whether that now becomes the default. And we'll talk a bit more about the implications of that anchor to other points that you make. But I wanted to kind of unpack that observation with you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are many paradigm shifts that are happening in the world and across sectors. And I think that however small in our sector of peace building, there is going to be a paradigm shift as a result of the pandemic. And the reason I say that is that, one of the impetuses for writing this blog post was that I had a series of conversations with people at Safer World, at Interpeace, at Mercy Corps, at the big kind of peace building traditional actors, who were literally saying, help, how do we even do our programming now? And in parallel, I was having a series of conversations with those of us like yourself who have been working on digital peace building for over a decade at this point, saying, how is it possible that we're still having this conversation, that we're still saying we're in the business of bringing people together and now we can't? Like, obviously we can, And I think at some point, Celia, who do virtual dialogue, I spoke to their CEO, Waidehi, who's a good friend, and she and I were reflecting on the fact that there was, digital peace building or peace tech or whatever you want to call it, ICT4Peace, was a sort of a silo for a long time. And over the past maybe 5 years, it's been spreading. and all of these larger peace building organizations have been incorporating people who work on technology, but it's still been a sort of a specialty. And what we were reflecting on is that essentially digital peace building just is peace building now. It doesn't make sense to think of it as a different thing. All peace building has a digital element now. And that's true for two reasons. One is the fact that there are a number of conflicts that are playing out in digital spaces, which is a different issue to the issue of the pandemic, although they're related, as you and I agree, I think. And the second is that as there are barriers to bringing people together physically, those barriers can actually be quite easily overcome now. And I think that's one of the things that I was trying to flesh out in this blog post, that we're in the business of bringing people together, and we absolutely can continue to do that. And in fact, there's an imperative to continue to do that. I wanted to open with that quote because I feel like it's the sense that a lot of people in the peace building field have right now.
One of the things that I was thinking of is that there is, however, to everything that you said, an element of that there is something that's changed, and I was trying to put my finger on it, and of the many things that have changed and could be added on, this reflection that you and I over Skype, and the virtual, the online mediated engagement has for many of us completely replaced IRL in real life, and that's new. And that has a lot of implications for academics, including those who will study this time years into the future. Let me give an example. So I did a data dive a couple of days ago around sentiments expressed on around 60 pages pegged to 3 main private television broadcasters in Sri Lanka over March. And this is important because these 3 stations are the ones that put out the most content, are the most viewed, are the most engaged with. I'm not talking about the quality of the content or the veracity of the content. I'm talking about the public acceptance of the content as touch points for the shaping of public discourse and the public imagination. And amongst many other things, Sri Lanka was inordinately more sad in March than in February as a consequence of coronavirus framing and content. But I did mention that for the first time, people like myself are able to use that as a proxy indicator of what a general population is thinking of as well, simply because the digital content is a proxy for the terrestrial broadcast. And there's no real life variable there. There literally is, because it's under curfew, right? So you have for the first time the frightening and fascinating prospects that open up as a consequence for the seeding and spread of information as well as the study of it. And the reason I bring this up as context is I think that, yes, you're right. We have been doing this, in my case, for close upon 20 years, but there is something different around the interactions that we are going to have post-COVID, or with the specter and shadow of COVID as well. Would you agree that there's something that's different?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it in describing this sort of clearer signal of sentiment, and also a broader signal of sentiment. So I think there are 2 things that are happening. One is we're essentially over a period of weeks and months. I think it's going to be months. We're going to have a vast proportion of the population, of the world's population, in a situation where suddenly online conversations become vital, right? To their mental health, to their ability to get supplies, to their ability to remain connected to their loved ones. And I think that is going to, you and I probably use the online realm in a much closer way to the way we use real life. We express a lot more of our life through than the vast majority of the population, right? Both for work and possibly for personal reasons. I think that is now going to become the vast majority of the population, even for people who just weren't doing that as much anymore. And I don't think that that's going to go away. Of course, maybe it'll lessen once the lockdowns ease up, but I think it's going to change the way that people experience the virtual space. I think it's going to become much closer to real life, because for a number of months, for a sustained period of time, it was real life, this is, this might seem irrelevant, but I see that a lot in the entertainment industry. how many musicians that you like have given an Instagram live gig or a YouTube live gig? I mean, I've been to two, confession, and they've been exceptional, and they've been surprised. James Blake was on Instagram going, "Wow, this might be the biggest gig I've ever played." What's that doing? Of course, he's still going to do live gigs. I'm not saying he won't, like in real life, but something's going to shift, right? And so I think that's important for a lot of reasons, but I think it's important for our field because it also means that the expressions of sentiment online, the expressions of identity online, are no longer mere signals that apply mostly to a proportion of the population that is younger and more male and more urban and all these things that we said, but they become.
This is the population now.
And that means that it's not just a signal,
but
it's also the construction of that discourse.
Exactly right. Exactly
and the construction of identity. So we used to say, like you and I have spoken before about the fact that, young men in certain contexts will have their identity, particularly their conflict identities, mediated by online media, right? We know that's the case. Like we know that's the case from like people being recruited into the far right in the US, through to the way that people get recruited into armed groups over Twitter. In Syria, etc., right? But if this now becomes the way that the vast majority of people express their identity, then, or one of the ways that they express their identity, then it really becomes a fundamental element of the conflict context. I think that's a big change.
I want to come back to that because that's kind of something that I want to touch on as well. But before that, and these are all interconnected, right? At least in my mind. There is a point that you make in a couple of points that you put out around how peace builders can and should be using technology. This is not new for you and I, but you kind of make the point that these are things that can be done post-COVID-19. And in the first bullet point, you talk about assessing conflict dynamics remotely. That's not what I wanted to kind of pick your brains on. Within that point, you make the assertion that peace builders can work remotely with quantitative and qualitative data, so quant and qual, which I agree with, but I wanted to pick your brain on, can we flesh that out? Because in both parts, you talk about peace builders as this monolithic entity, and you and I know, and I see you nodding your head, that we've talked about this in the past, right? Peace builders also is a huge spectrum. And the specific question I have is that, listen, we just talked about a world where data, sentiment analysis, data points are the touch points into society and polity. And if we don't understand how to harvest these, we don't understand how they're constructed, and we don't understand how they shift and shape public opinion, which is going to have a lasting impact into the future. So, what are I was thinking to myself, what the power dynamics are in peace building and amongst peace builders that will shape the ability of our community to use and leverage this data, because arguably, it's a cinch for you and I. This is what we've been doing. This is what we've been training. Yeah. This is what I'm doing my doctoral research on. But we are not peace builders. We can't speak for all peace builders. And what is it going to create now? This hierarchy? I don't know. This power dynamic between peace building and peace builders who can do this and can't do this. I mean, what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, honestly, I think that power dynamic exists. I think that the ability to, either procure or create data sets that provide evidence on drivers of conflict and baseline assessments in the situation of conflict is a power dynamic in peace building. It has been for a long time. Who tells the story of what's happening?
Yeah.
And this is, that I've for a long time been banging on about decolonizing data in peace building, frankly, in development in general, but specifically in peace building in my case. So I don't think that the conflict assessment of the Somali region should be carried out by a consultant to the World Bank. I think it should be carried out by local civil society actors. And I think that that requires skilling up in very particular ways. So you're right. It's a lazy shorthand to just say peace builders, but blog posts. And I think that one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how can we ensure that there is a greater democratization of the skills that are needed to work with quantitative and qualitative data remotely. And in fact, we're right now working on a set of, now I say this at the end of the blog post, we're working on a set of training courses that will be, I said in there, they'll be donation based, but they're actually going to be free, that are aimed at people who want to start working in this. I think there's actually, there is some, again, when we say quantitative and qualitative data, that's a very big range, right? But let's take it by parts. There is absolutely no reason why the vast majority of civil society, local civil society actors in any of the countries that I have experience in, couldn't be able to set up and run a remote quantitative survey. That's like it's not a super technically difficult thing to do. You need to think through a series of issues. How are you going to get to your indicators? How many of them do you want? How are you going to collect the data? What's the information ecosystem so that people can access the survey that you're providing? What kind of sampling are you going to do? How are you going to analyze it? It's not rocket science. We can give everybody those skills, right? Then let's talk about something like social media, working with social media data. Of course, there are certain things that a lot of people won't be able to do. But there's a number of things that people could start to do. Maybe not working with large big data troves, but maybe doing some kind of manual harvesting of data, analyzing it in a sort of semi-automated way. So not doing sentiment analysis that uses IBM Watson or whatever, but just actually doing some very simple sentiment analysis and being able to say something that is important to the context. Yeah. So I don't think this issue of the power dynamic of data, who has access to it and who's able to work with it, is new. I think it's going to become more important. And I think that means that what people like you and I have the responsibility to do is to ensure that those skills are available to as many people as possible, and don't just sit in Western educational institutions, essentially. Which, I don't know, sometimes I get the feeling that's what people think, where people think those skills are. There's an incredible amount of local skills in all the places where you and I have both worked, and also the ability to gain more. So.
Yeah, no, I was having a call in this morning with a party who shall remain unnamed, and I was trying to make the point that listen, there is this asymmetry in the attention given to a skill set. Say, I mean, the conversation was around disinformation and its study, and more local expertise on the identification of disinfo that is contextual, nuanced, language-based, and you can't parachute in paradigms and technology architectures that arguably aren't bad, but just won't work in a local context. And the point that I'm trying to make, which is a riff of yours, is that I think it's going to be fundamentally important to kind of do exactly what you said, which is to recognize local, contextual, the loci of knowledge, as opposed to going to where we are comfortable going to, which is IBM Watson or the global north for this kind of thing. But here's the rub, Helena, and this is kind of like my two final points, which are, kind of linked. For a long time, and again, this, at least I and you, I think, and we all have been talking about the privatization of data, where a few companies in Silicon Valley are the custodians of now the totality of our socio-political interaction, completely, and that is one concern that I have, and the implications of that moving forward as a civilization. What do we do with the data that is now in these walled gardens that we all inhabit without giving full thought to perpetuity, access, etc. But I was also thinking of access rights. Yeah. Who has and will have access to this surfeit of conversation and data that is being produced now and into the future? So it's a pre-COVID-19 issue, but it's certainly accentuated as a consequence of the pandemic. And you know, people have, you know, the pandemic is also a laundromat for Silicon Valley, right? It's a laundromat for reputation management. Because the conversation was about violence and toxicity on these platforms, and now the platforms are the saviors of our sanity. And it did occur to me that Zuckerberg was talking, for example, about a privacy pivot and the closing down of the platform and architecture, such that researchers like myself 3 years down the line won't be able to do the kind of study and research that we're doing, because the platform will be impervious to outsiders looking in. And that has a direct consequence on peace building. If you can't access these conversations, if you can't log it, if you can't record it, if you can't study it, if you have to pay for it. So it's the privatization of the content, as well as, we are completely hostage to decisions made around APIs that are profit oriented and anchored to profit. So, I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
I mean, I think it's part of an ongoing trend, right? You're saying 3 years from now, you might not be able to do the research you were doing now, but 3 years ago, you could have done a lot more.
I could have, and I'm pretty sure that I can't actually. I mean, I can hazard a guess that it's an informed.
Right. But I just mean, 3 years ago, the amount of data that you could get both from Twitter and from Facebook was significantly higher as a researcher. And right now, you can get it, but you have to be in a handful of very well endowed organizations in order to be able to do it. And there's this claim that it's a transparent process. I'm sure that you have tried to get access. We certainly have. We tried to get permission for a piece of research that was being done for UNDP Lebanon on refugee host community narratives on Facebook. Couldn't be more like, this is evidently a piece of research that is going to be good for the world, and it was denied. And I think that, and it's very common. We've spoken to other researchers, and it's fairly common to have those denied. So I think you're absolutely right that walling off and the access being controlled by companies is quite a concern. I have, however, over the past literally week or two, seen a number of calls directly to companies addressing this issue of access to data and the need to grant access to data to researchers. And I wonder whether there's increasingly openness to that. There's a couple of indications. You were saying that the pandemic is a laundromat for the social media companies because they're suddenly saving our mental health, and I don't disagree with that. But it's also exposed the incredible problem they have with misinformation, which we already knew. But the WHO has called it an infodemic. I don't think I had heard a UN agency make quite a strong statement before. So I think, I think there may be an opening there to say this data needs to remain accessible. You're skeptical of this point.
No, I'm not skeptical of the point you're making. It was a parenthetical kind of point that was going through my head, because I had tweeted very early on that one of the consequences of automated review and algorithmic curation, because you have shelter-in-place in San Francisco, and you have work from home at a global level around every company. And that's unprecedented, and they are completely dead in the water, right? They never planned for this. And one of the consequences of that is markets like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, where historically, even the investments, human and technical, in these markets have been abysmal or completely opaque at best, are now at a hostage to algorithms and automated review. And there are many stories around the fallout of that, right? So the obvious fallout is that there is a lot of misinfo that is not caught, that is not red flagged, but there's actually a lot of valid content critiquing the MISCO that is being taken down. So you have a complete mess, really. And you're right. I mean, it has brought up to the fore the flaws of these companies as they've been set up, but in a slightly different way to what you were saying as well. And I don't thing is that I don't know, Helena, where this is all going to end up. And I'm concerned in the short to medium term that we'll be setting up the foundations that are then the seeds, as opposed to kind of more sane structures. And I don't know, the jury's out on that. But I think
the jury is out, and can I say something on that? I think the jury is out, and I think one of the things that I don't know. I mean, I could be getting this wrong, but one of the things that I'm seeing in some of the comments from the big platform companies is kind of almost the beginnings of some humility about their ability to really understand everything that goes on their platforms. Like there's a lot going on in their platforms, and I think up to now, I'm sure you've had these conversations too, where you speak to someone at Facebook and you say, hey, I've been observing this in this obscure country where you don't have any staff, and here's what I think, and maybe you need to look into this, and they go, oh, we've already looked at that, and you go, have you? Like the answer is always we already know, right? And now the answer is not always we already know. Now the answer is, oh yes, we need to look into that. So if that creates an opening for a conversation about how more of us need to be involved in understanding what is happening on their platforms, and it can't just be left to their own research divisions, I think that would be a good thing.
I think it would be a good thing if they completely reprioritize the company.
Well, yes.
I mean, frankly, and this is kind of my last point, is that so here's the radical idea. Do people like us shift the Overton window to the world we want to inhabit without the incrementalism and the kind of tiptoeing around eggshells that we've done in the past? Because really, I mean, I read this article. It's actually like, so this is a really good article. It's about the normal economy is never coming back. It's a really good article, but for me, there was no critique in the article about the headline, which is the normal was not normal. The normal was unsustainable. The normal was wrong. And for me, I wonder whether it's a moment where these companies also reassess a profit model, a curation model, an architecture, a growth scaling and scoping, and a market penetration, which was utterly unsustainable.
Yeah. I mean, that's what paradigm shifts can do, right? Paradigm shifts can be a portal into a new reality. I don't know whether you read that beautiful article that Arundhati Roy wrote about the pandemic, and she called it, the pandemic is a portal, which I loved. So maybe it's a portal into a better way for platform companies to mediate our lives, especially when we know so much more of our lives are going to be mediated by those platforms.
I mean, as a final question, are you hopeful about a paradigm shift as a consequence of the pandemic?
I am, yes.
That is a long pause.
But it was a long pause because I am very aware of my own bias. I have a bias towards hope.
Yeah.
And it's what keeps me going. It's what drives me. I think it's been a wake-up call for a lot of people in a lot of places. And I think it's also created an energy towards wanting to do more, to do better, to do more together. There's this kind of like, I don't know there's somebody who keeps telling me, don't use social distancing, it's just physical distancing. There's actually less social distance.
Yeah.
And so I am hopeful in that sense. I'm also fearful, and I think that's what the big pause was about, of the huge, enormous, unthinkable inequities that the pandemic is going to further deepen. I'm tired of people saying that the pandemic is a great equalizer. It just isn't. The experiences of it are going to be so radically different. Yeah. My hope is that the fact that the seed of that difference is something that is similar, which is the pandemic, will create the kind of common ground that you and I know is needed for peace building. So yes, our experiences are radically different, but we stand on the common ground of the pandemic.
You think, right? You think. However, you and I are, you think and you hope, but I'm sitting on a growing, sadly, body of evidence that the projection of the pandemic can be through an identity lens, can be through an ethno-political lens, can be through a religious lens. And that is what is like graying my hair and, making me pull my hair out, because actually, no, I mean, prima facie, what you said isn't happening. That's not to say that I don't share the hope that it can happen and should happen, and that we should devote all our energies to it. I mean, I certainly, for one, will try to shift that Overton window by saying, actually, no, this is the moment that you think about radical change, and let's not pussyfoot around incrementalism at all. But I'm also acutely aware that's kind of the consequence of this doctoral research as well, which is that it gives me insights into things that ignorance would have been bliss.
Do you know what I think it is? I think you just, you keep saying, let's not tiptoe around, let's not pussyfoot around. And I think I know what it is. In the same way that you and I are saying, oh man, like suddenly all these governments that were like tiptoeing towards authoritarianism are like,
just like
boom, now we're just going to do it.
Yeah.
I guess that my sense is that, it could also go the other way. Like there could also be civil society that's just, on climate change, that could just be like, no, boom, like it's over.
Yeah.
And so maybe and that's what my pause was about. Maybe it's not that I'm hopeful, it's that I know there's a big change coming.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, well, go this way, go this way. And I think that, I also hold the fear, as you do, that we become an increasingly divided, populist, authoritarian world. And I think there's a real possibility that would happen. But I think there's also a real possibility that the opposite would happen. And I think what's most likely is that in some places it'll go one way, and in other places it'll go the other way. And that's going to be something to watch, I think, not just for the next year, but for the next decade.
And that is why the work you do is so important. And in a sense, the work we are all engaged in has continued relevance as well. Helena, thanks so much for this conversation. I'm going to stop the recording now, though we can talk for so much longer. And I hope that this sparks some critical discussion around both your excellent submissions on the Build Please blog, but also around the work that you've been doing around the world.
Thank you.